Dear Mr. Landaumann, dear members of the Swiss Parliament, dear ambassadors, we have ambassadors here from Lithuania, from UK, from France, from Liechtenstein, I have to say, and of course from the Netherlands. That's fair enough. Dear Mr. Bartole, ladies and gentlemen, dear Frans Timmermans, it's a great honor for me to welcome you, Mr. Timmermans, tonight here on behalf of the University of Zurich and of the Europa Institute at the Churchill Symposium 2024. We are very grateful to have you here among us tonight. Thank you very much for coming. As you know, you are part of a long line of other impressive speakers, just to mention Helmut Kohl, Giscard d'Estaing, Richard von Weizsäcker, Tony Blair, Edward Heath, Romano Prodi, Jean-Claude Juncker, many others were here before you. And you later on, standing here, will speak from the same spot as Winston Churchill did. 1946 was it when it took place here. Of course, you remember this plate over there. It's in a way interesting. Some people, maybe even many people, say that this speech was the initiation of the European integration process. Think about that. A Brit in Switzerland was the initiation about the European integration process. Whatever that means, right? Whatever that means. Now, Churchill spoke about the end of the war, and of course also about the Iron Curtain, and that's also your topic tonight, and this will be very interesting. Something that we all had thought it's not coming back again, right? Suddenly stands in front of the door. We all, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, believed in eternal peace, and we all reduced our armies and we did less spending on military things, and today it's just the opposite. We are back where we thought we would never be back, and we are very interested to learn what you are thinking about that and how we should, in a way, respond to these new threats and insecurities. Now, you were born, Mr. Timmermans, in 1961 in Maastricht, another important European city, obviously. Later, you entered the diplomatic service, and in 1998, you became a member of the Dutch Parliament for the Labour Party. Soon after, in 2012, you were sworn in as the Netherlands' foreign minister after having previously served already as a state secretary for European cooperation. You left the Dutch government, if I'm right, after only 2 years serving in the government, right? After only 2 years, you left and you went to Brussels. And in Brussels, you became the first vice president of the European Commission in charge of better regulation, something we are all looking forward still today, right? You might have the magic key for better regulation. But also international institutional relations, rule of law, and the Charter of Fundamental Rights, all very important topics. In 2019, you were the leader of the European Parliament group of the Social Democrats during the European elections, and after the successful elections for your party, you became the European Commission's Vice President for the European Green Deal. In this position, you steered ambitious Green Deal legislations such as the Green Deal and the Natural Restoration Act through this legislative process in the European Union. You resigned as an EU Commissioner in 2023, so not very long ago, and took over as a leader of the Grün-Links PVDA party. You might explain exactly what it is, but I remember it is a Social Democratic Party of the Netherlands, where you are now the leader of the opposition in the Dutch Parliament. Mr. Timmermans, we are very interested in your thoughts, and the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
What can one say after such a kind introduction? Much too generous. Reminds me of something Churchill said about I think he said about Clement Attlee when he said, Mr. Attlee is indeed a very modest man. But then again, Mr. Attlee has a lot to be modest about. And I think this could well apply to me. Professor Callahan's, dear ambassadors, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, especially warm welcome to my dear colleagues from the Swiss Parliament coming here from Bern. And thinking of Bern, I'm reminded of something a good friend of mine said, with whom I worked for many years in the OSCE, Ambassador Benedict von Charner. I don't know if you know him. He's a good friend of mine. He said, "You know, I'm from Bern, and if you have to have an operation on your head, if you have something in your brain that needs to be fixed, it is twice as expensive if you're from Bern than if you're from Zurich." And I asked him, "So why?" He said, "Well, we in Bern, we have such thick skulls, it takes hours to get through it." But anyway, I'm not here to talk about Benedict von Charner or Bern. I'm here to talk about one of the greatest men that we've ever seen in European history. It goes without saying that if one is asked to deliver a Churchill speech in Zurich, one first reads Churchill's Zurich speech. It amazes because it is short, it's to the point, historic, and beautifully written, as one could expect from someone who was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. Two thoughts stand out in his speech. First, only 1 year after the end of the war, he declares that a partnership between France and Germany should be the bedrock upon which Europe's security and prosperity will reside. This seems to us today self-evident, but was revolutionary at the time. Second, Churchill gives a stark warning that the window of opportunity will not stay open for very long, a warning that the founding fathers of the Council of Europe and later the EEC took seriously, for which we should be eternally grateful. It is a warning, ladies and gentlemen, that remains valid also today. One of the most important qualities of great leaders is to see a window of opportunity and act upon it, even if public opinion is not on your side, or not on your side yet. And what a delight it is to rediscover his expression of, and I quote, enlarged patriotism and common citizenship as fundamental principles of our common European destiny. At a time when the radical right in Europe, including movements based on the heritage of the Nazi regime, claim to be patriots and sell nationalism as snake oil. Churchill sees oblivion as part of the solution. Europeans should overcome their deep divisions by reconciliation, and that requires shelving, if not forgetting, the horrors of the past. Perhaps this is the only part of the speech I disagree with. Perhaps oblivion is today one of the reasons why the far right can fool people into believing that nationalism is the same as patriotism. The professionals and pundits who've reached positions of power and influence tend to see the world through the very same lenses that have served them so well over a career. As they progress, they've seen many scares and have learned to judge situations, and most often, the great scares didn't come about. Therefore, it's very fashionable for these respectable people to play down words, threats, and events with a soothing, "Don't worry, don't dramatize, this too will pass, our adversaries are rational." While this gives succor to their audience, they surely know what they're talking about, and tells people what they want to hear. It's not going to be that bad. It is right. It's not going to be that bad until it isn't. We live in a time of turmoil where decades of history are being made in a matter of months. We cannot predict what the world will look like in half a year's time, but we can predict that many changes are coming. There is no longer need for leaders who lull us into a false sense of security. We need leadership that tries to peer through the fog, has a vision of hope, or what can be if we put our brains, muscles, and heart into it, but also who have the ability to imagine of what could happen in the worst case and prepare for it to avert it. Thus, Leadership in this age requires a rare combination of humility to know that we know very little, yet an open mind to think outside the box and avoid a failure of imagination. Churchill, as Andrew Roberts describes in his excellent biography, has many faults, but he did not suffer of a failure of imagination. Do read that book if you like biographies, by the way. Let me note an extraordinary example that is often forgotten or neglected. Even Mr. Roberts does not mention it in his otherwise instant classic book. It is a story that is recounted in the first chapter of Jean Monnet's autobiography. War had broken out. France was about to collapse, and Monet had come with an idea to merge Britain with France. One army, one parliament, one coin, one nation. He went to Churchill to convince him of this necessity. Churchill, the man who harked back to his ancestor, the Duke of Marlborough, who valiantly fought the French, an antagonist and rival even before the times of Azincourt. Surely every pundit in their right mind would scoff, roll their eyes, and laugh such an idiotic idea off. And yet, Churchill did not. He, in fact, agreed, convinced his cabinet, and telegraphed a letter back. That telegraph came hours too late, and the rest is history. But this example shows that in extraordinary times, we need extraordinary leaders to have the imagination to come up with solutions that are fit to address the challenge we're confronted with. The same sense of prescience is found in his Zurich speech. His call for a blessed act of oblivion, which today, sadly, Europeans seem to take in a completely different and dangerous direction. He referred to Gladstone, but he could have referred to the English Parliament that limited reprisals only against those who had taken part in the regicide of King Charles I. He said this at a time when the ashes of Europe destroyed were still smouldering due to the aggressive and evil force of Nazism. He called for an act of oblivion so we could move forward. And I quote, "If Europe is to be saved from infinite misery and indeed from final doom, there must be this act of faith in the European family, this act of oblivion." So the act of faith is not an act of forgetting, but is an act of overcoming past horrors. In this, Churchill shows the extent of his statesmanship, but also of his humanity. Now, 78 years later, we can look back and only commend him for his wisdom and prescience. He was right. He is right. The timeline of human history is written in blood. Despite the technological pinnacle that humanity has reached, the sinews of our soul are the same as our ancestors who first took up a club to beat off a threatening Neanderthal or neighbor. Reading Thucydides' account of the Peloponnesian War almost 2,500 years ago, one cannot but be struck by the fact that despite Churchill's almost unsurpassed eloquence, nothing that we have said has not been said before, and often better, by the Hellenistic tribes of that age. The difference is, Churchill gave us his seminal speech here after the Second World War was over and Europe lay ravaged. We've come here today when Europe is whole and free, but for all practical purposes find ourselves in the early stages of a war, but now with a new context. With artificial intelligence blurring our view of what is real, what is fake, what is right, what is wrong, with social media weaponized to divide us at home, cyber capabilities to disrupt our societies, and with great powers who all have nuclear weapons and response times below 15 minutes, our plight is more complex and arguably more dangerous. To step up requires the capacity of imagination. It requires a whole of society approach, all hands on deck. And it requires the courage and heart to stand up and defend our rule of law, human rights, and democracy against our adversaries who have already decided to fight us. As Benjamin Franklin said, and I quote, "Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety," end of quote. And I would add, not only do they not deserve it, they will certainly not get it. We have to be clear about it. Our democracies are not self-executing. They're also not irreversible. In fact, they're being attacked from within and from without as we speak. But if we don't see the signs, hear the alarming words, feel the impending danger, we in fact prepare the path for the powers who want to overthrow democracy. One should heed the words of hate, listen, and take seriously what some of these politicians say. And if their claims are outlandish, we should not discard them haughtily, but prick up our ears and listen very carefully. I followed very closely the Soviet Union and Russia since the mid to late 1980s. Since the mid to late 1980s, I served in Moscow in the first 3 years of the 90s, years of extreme turmoil. And in the decades since, following developments there has remained a professional and personal passion. Out of the many, many things I could share with you, let me mention one. Autocrats are always very clear about their goals. You should not only take them seriously, but literally as well. Putin's plans to first consolidate and then restore the Russian Empire, his obvious imperial ambitions, were clear from the outset because he didn't hide them. He spoke about them openly. The historic mistake of the West was to take him seriously, but not literally, all too happy that he brought stability to a nation shaken by an identity crisis, economic and social turmoil, and loss of a sense of purpose. Today, more than 1,000 days have passed since he invaded Ukraine in an effort to add an independent European nation to his empire. The level of destruction and human suffering surpasses anything we have seen in Europe since the Second World War. Make no mistake, he is waging war against all liberal democracies in Europe and stops at nothing to destabilize our nations and help his cronies and admirers to come to power and undermine the very fabric of our democracy. If anyone has the illusion he would not act in a covert and perhaps even open military way against us, they should think again. Calling him in the hope of convincing him to look for peace is, in my view, beyond naive. He will see it for what it is: weakness and desperation. The only way to bring about peace is by making sure he cannot win, by giving far more support to Ukraine, even if the incoming American administration would not step in as they did before. Then we must step in as Europeans and not forget our duty to ourselves, to our continent, to our liberties, to our freedom. This, ladies and gentlemen, is a fight for our common European destiny. Ukrainians are doing all the fighting, are doing all the dying. We should at least be responsible enough to make sure they are not starved of arms and finances. As those who have experienced National Socialism in Europe are dying out, living memory is turning into written history. At the same time, less and less people are reading books. Articles of barely 100 words, let alone tweets or TikTok clips, in my view, don't count. It is no wonder that the demons of the past are rearing their ugly heads again. I'm quite sure that Churchill would agree with me that this is the wrong kind of oblivion. Our youngest generation are farther and farther removed of the darkest past of this continent. And let me add to this, I have never felt more hopeful looking at our youngest generation. They are the best educated, the best connected, the best in position to take over the lead and lead us into a brighter future. But they need guidance from older generations who all too often rest on their laurels instead of stepping up their efforts. And I think my generation is largely to blame for that, not the younger generation. I've often quoted the following, and I'm sure you will recognize, most of you will recognize the intended message. And I give you this quote: "We are fighting an enemy that is different from us, not open, but hiding, not straightforward, but crafty, not honest, but base, not national, but international, does not believe in working, but speculates with money, does not have its homeland, but feels it owns the whole world. End of quote. When I heard this in 2018, all my alarm bells went off. But when I taught this in university and told my students about this and asked them, do they recognize what the inherent message is? Do they hear, as I do, Jew? Nobody recognized the intended message anymore. This text could have come from some of the darkest publications in Nazi Germany, only it didn't. It was said by Hungarian Prime Minister Orbán, Putin's Renfield, during a campaign rally in March 2018. If we are no longer able to recognize hate speech, it means that we will be susceptible to it. There are politicians like Orbán, Putin, Farage, Trump, Fico, Wilders in my country, and others who are becoming ever more bold in introducing hate speech, pinning the blame on the other, foreigners, Muslims, Jews, immigrants, but also on the establishment, mainstream media, academics, doctors, lawyers, teachers. By the way, we tend to forget it because they're hiding it now, but all these politicians I've mentioned at some point expressed their deep admiration for Putin, even if today they sometimes try to hide the same fact. The taboo of outright and brazen lying has been broken over and over by Trump, and others are using his playbook, tapping into the veins of anger, fear, and hate. I think Bannon, his ideologue, calls it flooding the zone with lies so that nobody can recognize the truth anymore. They will do their worst. No one can stop them from uttering their bile. But where's the rest? The success of the national populists is the failure of the rest of us, whether we are from the left or the right. We've left the pitch to those who play to our darker angels and have neglected to play to our better angels. So every harsh word I express on my opponents is also directed at me, myself, and the political movements of the traditional parties and left and center right who have not been able to face up to what is happening. It means that having a message of hope and salvation, policies that can genuinely better people's lives, but all people's lives, this is what we need to do. It means transcending the interest of the consumer who maximizes and thinks of his or her wallet only, and defining the interest of free citizens who yearn to be part of something larger. We've turned citizens into consumers. We need to turn them back into citizens. That is essentially our main task. We also have to rekindle critical thinking, and I cannot emphasize enough the critical role of education and universities in this process. One of the effects of the internet is that critical thinking has been pushed away, and that our methods of teaching critical thinking have become obsolete, but we haven't found new methods yet. Telling people to go and look for something used to be a task that took weeks. When I was a student, it takes seconds, thanks to Professor Google, now. So if you want people to be able to discern, which is the basis of critical thinking, we have to find other ways than just telling them to go and look for something. So I think, and it is not by chance, like in my country, that if the radical right comes to power, the first budget cuts are in education, in media, in the arts, in culture, because those are the places where critical thinking is formed. Those are the places where you learn to discern lies from the truth. We have to rekindle critical thinking. We have to rekindle knowledge of our history. We have to avoid the trap of relativism that seems so modern, yet is the road to nowhere. The truth or morality never lies in the middle. There is right, there is wrong, and we have to spell it out and never back down. Otherwise, never again will become a hollow phrase. It is my view that the European Union has been more successful than Churchill could have imagined in 1946. With 27 member states, 450 million citizens, more preparing their membership in the antechamber, the biggest internal market in the world, rich, well-educated, free, no death penalty. If one would ask an oblivious, unborn child, where would you want to be born and when, the answer would probably be, let it be in Europe in the 21st century. Yet, we so often have a different view of ourselves. Our duty is to rekindle the values our forebears fought, sacrificed, and died for. Their legacy lives on in NATO and the EU. However, this is not a self-executing legacy, but one that we have to constantly nurture and bolster. For to be part of an alliance or a union has a special meaning. Membership is no small thing. It is not a buffet where one can pick and choose as one pleases. It signifies a commonality of values and interests, of rights and obligations, and the voluntary will and express intent to work together closely to further these values and defend those interests globally. All members will have to recommit to these values, live according to these values, show solidarity in defense of these values, or ask themselves whether they still belong. Prime Minister Orban says he is for peace. It is true, Putin wants peace too, once he has conquered Ukraine. Never before have we witnessed a presidency of the Council of the European Union who, for all practical purposes, gives the impression that he is a bridgehead to Moscow, a Moscow that is a direct threat to our security and our liberty. The EU is coming to see that the price to outsourcing one's foreign and security policy may be too high. Free ridership starts out cheaply, but can come back with a damaging surcharge. Traditional threats are still relevant, some, like nuclear weapons, even gaining in relevance. There are also new asymmetrical and hybrid threats, such as terrorism, cyber, and even the abhorrent practice of using migrants as a tool of foreign policy, such as Belarus is doing right now at the border of Poland. All of these risks must, of course, figure in NATO's and the EU's strategic reviews. And while we assess our risks and debate our response, we should avoid the false and nefarious dichotomy between NATO and the EU and oppose those who say there is a choice between the two. That is a false choice. If you don't watch out, you may end up in a catch-22 situation where both a strong and a weak EU are a risk to NATO. I'm absolutely convinced that a strong and credible EU makes for a strong and credible NATO, and vice versa. And it gives me great pleasure to say this explicitly in a neutral country. Moreover, we should also avoid understandable, though misguided, knee-jerk reactions of going it alone. America first quickly descends into America alone, and that is a sure recipe for failure. And let's be clear, there's neither going to be a Europe first, let alone Europe going solo. Such unilateral propositions would weaken us both and sink our common causes and lower our common defenses. That doesn't mean one cannot do more. Article 42 of the Treaty on the European Union has a very demanding obligation to aid and assist by all means any member state who is the victim of armed aggression. At the same time, the article makes clear that NATO remains the foundation of their collective defense and the forum for its implementation. Herein lays what I would call the Goldilocks balance. And let us be frank, in the EU, we're nowhere near there. The EU will have to bear its part of the burden and continue the trend of significantly increasing its defense funding, strengthening its cooperation, and even consider more effective integration of its foreign and defense policy and capabilities from civil to military capabilities. One cannot commit to an alliance or union, enjoy its security and riches, but dodge its responsibilities and close the curtains when reality knocks on the door. Strengthening the EU's common capabilities and common political will to deploy them will not happen at once or overnight. Security cooperation, let alone integration, is the most sensible of sovereignties with national parliamentary oversight, and rightfully so. But let us begin exploring the possibilities with a sense of urgency. A reinvigorated alliance also requires a strong and principled political commitment by the United States of America. An effective alliance doesn't have an on-off button. Moreover, it requires a rebalancing within NATO, and with a stronger European defense capability should come a stronger European voice and the possibility of closely prescribed autonomous action when needed. Of course, there are numerous reasons why such a strengthened EU defense autonomy is difficult and nigh impossible. There's nothing easier than explaining why anything cannot be done. But leadership and statecraft are necessary ingredients to overcome the fear of bureaucratic controversy in times of need. Schuman was right in 1950, and he would be right today, and I quote, "World peace cannot be safeguarded without the making of creative efforts proportionate to the dangers which threaten it," end of quote. However, aside from our traditional reflex to blow the dust off all the plans laying on the shelf in terms of command structures, strategic lift, civil and military capabilities, talking about hardware, preparing for future conflicts, increasing resilience to new threats such as climate change, terrorism, cyber warfare, and hybrid wars, we perhaps have to take an honest look in the mirror first. What are we fighting for? And what are we ultimately defending? This brings me back to Churchill. In everything we do, in everything we undertake, we must never lose sight of who we are or who we want to be. It is in our constitutions of every single member state. Also, in Switzerland, it is the bedrock of our treaties, EU treaties, Article 2. These are precious values. They can be lost if we fail to defend them to the hilt. And the time is now, for as the saying goes, one defends one's freedoms while one still has them, not when they are already taken away. The re-election of Donald Trump marks a watershed moment in the transatlantic relationship. In the past few weeks, the contours of his administration have become clear. One gets, and it's my personal observation, one gets the impression of a government of billionaires, by billionaires, for billionaires. It remains to be seen what the consequences for Europe are, but frankly, I tend not to be overly pessimistic. We must not forget that the transatlantic relationship has been declared dead at least a dozen times in the past 60 years in my lifetime. Kissinger even wrote a book about it, which he called The Troubled Partnership. I'll come back another time and tell you about my experience with Kissinger, not taking it now. For my generation of Europeans, the United States will always be seen as a liberator. At Margraten War Cemetery, which is close to where I live in Maastricht, I adopted the grave of Leo Lichten. He was a young man from New York. He was just 19 years old when he was killed in action just across the border in Germany. And in his letters, he wrote that he was willing to sacrifice his life to fight the great evil of Nazism. We can never forget these sacrifices. We may never understand the full extent of what a young man of 19 does, pledging his life to fight Nazism. And he keeps inspiring me. He never got over 19. He would be over 90 by now, but it's still a young man that keeps inspiring me until today. With the United States as security provider, Western European societies experienced a time of unprecedented prosperity and stability. Indeed, our hope was that this time would never come to an end. For Americans, on the other hand, it's different. It has been since the birth of their nation, when the founding fathers warned against foreign entanglements. Dwight Eisenhower famously said in 1951, and I quote, "If in 10 years all American troops stationed in Europe for national defense purposes have not been returned to the United States, then this whole project will have failed." 1951. It soon became clear that America's commitment to this project, referred to as Building Europe, was going to be intensified and prolonged, especially after the threat of the Soviet Union became more apparent. And in Churchill's words, the Iron Curtain descended on the continent. Now, let me be clear. I wish the United States to continue to play a key role in our collective security. And there is no other option than to try to convince Trump it is in his own interest to stand by the rules of the international order formed by his predecessors after the Second World War. The war fatigue we see in the eyes of brave Ukrainians is something none of us can afford all too long. Recently, an aide to Trump's presidential campaign said that Ukrainians should refocus their efforts on peace. But the reality is that that's all they've been doing since the beginning of Putin's war of aggression, focusing on peace. Take the city of Mariupol, where thousands of civilians have been left dead, and there have been sustained efforts to erase the Ukrainian historical memory in the city. In Kharkivska, Ukrainian language is suppressed, and history books glorifying Russian history have become part of the school curriculum, not even to mention all the children that have been abducted and taken to Russia, who've now been put up for adoption for Russian couples. Is this the definition of peace? Are these actions that should be rewarded by a peace offer? Exposing more Ukrainians to these brutal practices by making them give up large parts of their country? I don't think so. What was true 1,000 days ago is true now. It is up to the Ukrainian people to decide when it's time to go to the negotiation table. Until that time, we need to stand firmly by them. I can't say this enough. As a consequence of the war, a record number of NATO members have stepped up and are now meeting the 2% target, including my country, the Netherlands. Europe is outspending the United States in their support for Ukraine, but with the recent election, it is inevitable that Europeans need to be ready to do more. My party is ready to support efforts to do more. Donald Tusk's initiative to build an alliance in support of Ukraine that includes the UK is a welcome and necessary step. And I believe even more spending on defense should be on the table. And I also believe that Donald Tusk is going to be one of the European leaders we will all look up to in the next couple of years. 70 years after the proposal for a European defense community, we see 27 different national militaries. If we finally want to work towards a true European defense pillar, we must further integrate our defense systems and address the capability gaps that we still have on this continent. The reality is that European militaries are not set up to conduct operations without the help of the United States. Putin's war has also brought to light Europe's economic and industrial weaknesses. Europe's competitiveness increasingly lags behind the other global players, in particular the US and China. Bold action is required, as was ruthlessly analyzed by Mario Draghi and Enrico Letta in their recent reports. Without large New Deal kind of investments in the future, the EU will die a slow and agonizing death, in Draghi's words. Together, we need to close the innovation gap with the US and China, speed up the energy transition, and secure the supply chains of key technologies. And let me highlight one urgent need, and that includes Switzerland. We need to increase the speed of energy transition exponentially. In the last years, after the beginning of the war, the energy prices in Europe have doubled. The energy price in the United States has gone down. That is not, and renewable energy in China is booming. That is not a good basis to become competitive. Our industry will be killed by high energy prices if we do not speed up the transition to renewable energy, which is the only homegrown energy we Europeans have. Nothing in Europe works better to incite a heating argument than a call for extra money, working like a red rag to a bull. I have the impression this applies to Switzerland as well, not just to my country. And it was no surprise that almost immediately countries started to react along the all too familiar lines we have seen in the financial crisis. The divide between North and South, frugals versus so-called cohesion countries, it's a false dichotomy. We overcame that dichotomy when faced with the horrible consequences of the pandemic. Surely we don't want to rekindle it today. It seems to rear its ugly head again today, and we should be much more outspoken and clear about what is at stake and which levels of investment will be necessary. We need a capital markets union. We needed it yesterday. We will need it tomorrow. And I implore Switzerland to make efforts to be part of that. It is in the interest of Swiss economic and industrial development just as much as it is of the rest of the European Union. Here again, the false patriots of the far right are weakening us with their divisive rhetoric. There is no protection in nationalism, no future in confrontation with neighbors with whom you share a common destiny, no solution in false promises, no comfort in scapegoating the other. Creating enemies within only helps the autocrats without, and sadly also within. In a healthy body politic, citizens should be able to choose between different parties and their different programs, but with the knowledge that whoever wins, they will respect the rule of law and the fundamental freedoms that have shaped our society since the end of the Second World War. The consensus has been that to govern, one must be decent and protect the minorities. Those who lost the election know that in the next 4 or 5 years, there is another chance to win. Nowadays, our democracies are afflicted with a new syndrome, namely that every election is a flip of the dime where the center holds or whether the would-be autocrats come into office. And every time the center holds, it becomes smaller as it governs and spends political capital while the fringes grow. Once the extremes win, we suddenly are debating about democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, whereas we should be debating about interest rates, housing, healthcare, education, and infrastructure. The debate in my country since Wilders came to power is about racism, identity, disrespect for the rule of law. The government stokes divisions, increases societal tensions, burns bridges between communities instead of building them. Political differences between the left and the right are part and parcel of national and European politics. These differences can lead to political confrontations and societal tensions. But there was always a common baseline. Certain boundaries were not crossed, such as the respect for the rule of law, for facts, and our fundamental freedoms. This has completely changed. We've seen it in Sweden and Spain and the Netherlands, where parties that used to belong to the center are now working closely with the far right. And so far, this leads to a center-right slowly becoming indistinguishable from the far right. Not because the far right moves in their direction, which is what they hoped would happen, but because the contrary is happening. And now it's happening in the European Parliament, where the European People's Party has sought cooperation with Alternative für Deutschland and also Orban's Patriots. Last week, the new bromance between these groups, so between the EPP and the far right, tried to torpedo an important deforestation regulation. They want to be a constructive partner in Europe, but in reality, the EPP has been working hard to undermine the very same values that underpin it. This places a big responsibility on the shoulders of Social Democrats and Greens in the years to come, because what we won't be is a bystander when the rights and interests of Europeans are being compromised. And let me say this in the clearest possible terms. We have a collective responsibility, whether from the left or the right, to strengthen the center. The center needs to hold and become stronger again, become attractive again to voters who are now fleeing from the center. If one of us, center-right or center-left, abandons the center, why would voters stay there? Politicians often underestimate the effect of their words and their action. Very often we think we are led by the people, but in fact we are leading very often by what we say, and then seek confirmation of what we say in reactions of the public, instead of being bold and saying what you think and saying where we need to go, and then hope that people will support you. And if they don't, fair enough, but you stay true to your values. We can stoke divisions and foster radicalization, which in the last decades has been done very successfully, but we can also decide to build bridges, address injustices and inequalities, and advocate respect and tolerance. The fear of the center-right to come too close to the center-left has, certainly in the EU and also in my country, led to the situation that they have come too close to the far right, becoming almost indistinguishable from them. After the last elections in my country, the leader of the traditional big center-right party said clearly she would prefer to rule with the far right than with Social Democrats. And this is unprecedented in history. By the way, her predecessor, leader of the party, had created a cordon sanitaire, which would not allow the far right into government. She first broke down the cordon sanitaire and then said she would rather form a government with them and certainly not with us. Well, the results are clear by now. The far right get absolutely nothing done but create ever deeper divisions in society and dragging the center-right with them in a blur of hate and incompetence. And I honestly hope that this is not going to last too long, because there are, it's very strange to hear it from me, but there are very many people of high quality with good intentions in the center-right, and they are sort of pushed away from power structures, and they should be able to come back and form coalitions with other well-meaning and parties attached to liberal democracy. In 2018, German professor in literary studies Aleida Assmann wrote a book called Der Europäische Traum. We all heard of the American dream, but what's the European dream? Assmann's point in the book is that in order to move on after the Second World War, we participated in an act of communal forgetting, what Churchill called act of oblivion. Forget and forgive in order to move on towards a more peaceful time. In the decades that followed, we created a collective image as a beacon of human rights and democracy, virtues we've come to call fundamental values in our European Union, and that form the gateway for countries to join the club. The treaties of Rome, signed in 1957, lay the foundations of an ever closer union among the peoples of Europe. With this, leaders of the founding member states expressed that European integration transcends more technocratic economic cooperation. Working towards European unity, a continent of prosperity and peace, is and has always been an inherently political project. In the Brexit referendum, the phrase, the ever closer union, got a life of its own. It became one of the main arguments for the Brexiteers. Today, it is, in my view, blatantly obvious that Brexit was the single worst act of self-harm any European nation has inflicted upon itself since the end of World War II. The most powerful political slogan of the last decade, "Take back control," had a huge impact on the campaign, but did not materialize in practice. Even if today, in British, or should I say English politics, it is still taboo to talk about it. And let me just say, a sidestep, the turmoil you see now with the farming community in the UK, I tell you, would not have happened if Britain were still in the EU and farmers in the UK would still profit from the common agricultural policy. But this is just a sideline. Brexit failed because it did not bring back control. On the contrary, it did great harm to the British economy and to Europe's position in the world. Let me be clear, Britain was hurt, but Europe was hurt as well. It has also brought to light how interdependent we are, and that we are in dire need to embrace Churchill's concept of enlarged patriotism. With the profound global challenges we face today, to which we can only find solutions if operating together, we need to unapologetically advocate for an ever closer union to address Putin's aggression in the East, tackle the climate catastrophe, and to increase our competitiveness in the world. Professor Tim Snyder describes European integration as Europe's post-imperialistic project. To wean ourselves of our imperialistic and colonial past, a vision of European nations as sharing sovereignty, and create the enlarged patriotism and common citizenship Churchill foresaw. And what Putin is doing is reintroducing imperialism in European politics. That is why it's so fundamentally dangerous for all of us. Today, more citizens than ever before in my lifetime have become skeptical of liberal democracy and tempted by what I would call democratur, winner-takes-all democracy, and far more vertical power structures. This version of democracy is popular in most of the BRIC countries and gains popularity in the Western world. On top of that, post-pandemic politics is characterized by incumbents in liberal democracies losing elections. This enhances insecurity and further undermines belief in liberal democracy itself. In practice, the new populist or autocratic incumbents have in common that they make huge and unrealistic promises, fail to deliver, never even having had the intention to deliver, by the way, and blame a scapegoat for this failure and then start a fight with the scapegoat. They can get away with it as long as the narrative of the enemy within is successful, a narrative that thrives in societies where groups of citizens are tempted to retreat in their own bubbles of like-minded people. Recently, an American study showed that on both the left and the right, people thought the other had far more negative views of them. You ask people on the left, what do you think the right thinks of you? And then they come up with sort of a demonic description of themselves. And then you go, ask the right, what do you think of the left? And it's far less bad than people think. And this is on both sides, and we should learn from that. Like almost a century ago, people who objectively have strong common socioeconomic interest are pitted against each other like mortal enemies on the basis of mostly fabricated enmities of identitarian or cultural nature. You know, the fights we saw sorry to quote the UK again, but I follow it closely. The fights we saw after a misinterpreted violent incident in the UK where people went and ravaged places where asylum seekers were, those fights were between people who have the same interest, who are both suffering in society, who are both poor, who are both have lack of opportunity, and they are pitted against each other. That's such a shame. That's something we really need to address. Our responsibility is to see the threat in all its aspects and to tackle every aspect indefatigably until we overcome. We owe this to our ancestors, like Winston Churchill and his glorious generation, and I cannot tell you how honored I am to stand at the same place he once stood. But above all, we owe it to the generations that will come after us and that deserve not to revisit the horrors of the past. Haven't we learned? Let's agree to be good ancestors ourselves. It's a fight, sure, but it's a fight that can be won. But to win a fight, you have to show up for the fight and understand what is at stake. It is our civic and democratic duty to be relentless in mobilizing all people of goodwill to defend and strengthen the liberties and socioeconomic values we hold dear. Let's put out fires, tear down walls, and build bridges. It can be done. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Timmermans, for this excellent, passionate, pro-European speech you delivered here in Zurich. It's in a way rare these days that you hear, this pro-European belief so strongly. Most people, or many people in these days are more kind of, getting back and retrieving from the European idea that we used to believe in. And this was wonderful. Thank you so much. We have already an agreement, right? You're now the leader of the opposition party in your country, and we said when you become the next prime minister of the Netherlands, you come back and you'll deliver this other speech about Kissinger and all that you mentioned before. Wonderful. We will welcome you back very much. Thank you. Wonderful. Now we have a discussion with you. Christa Markwald and I will talk a bit about what you said, or maybe some additional ideas. And then you open, as always, to the Q&A session. Please be prepared and ask questions to Mr. Timmermans. Okay, please, I can ask you to come forward.
That's what I believe in.
Thank you so much, Mr. Timmermans. I was thinking about this conflict we have right now with Ukraine, Russia, and all that. Realistically, what do you think, where will it be in 5 years from now?
It all depends on our resolve. I think we overestimate Russia's capacity to continue. They have huge human capacities, but their economic capacities are really reaching an end now. Even with all the oil and gas they're still exporting, their economy is collapsing. The interest rate is now at 25% if you want a mortgage. The price of butter has gone up, I think 35%. The price of potatoes, 65%. And these are primary goods that low-income Russians depend on. So the suffering is great. Of course, it's a totalitarian state, so you can hide all the unrest in the state, but it's causing increasing trouble. So the only thing we need to do is hold out. The problem I see happening now is that Putin makes the same calculation, and he's trying to gain as much terrain as he can get until Trump comes into power, and then he hopes that Trump freezes the conflict where it stands. And I think we as Europeans should convince Trump that that is a bad strategy. If we convince him to stay the course, if we as Europeans put up more money, more weaponry for Ukraine to be able to defend itself, then in 5 years from now we will be negotiating Ukrainian membership of the European Union and not fighting Russia to advance ever further in Europe, threatening the Baltic states, threatening Moldova and other independent European states that deserve to be free.
Maybe I can just ask an additional question, and also from my side, thank you so much for your excellent and impressive speech. But how could a fair peace look from a Ukrainian perspective, and from your perspective look like?
Well, I think the definition of a fair peace is in the hands of the Ukrainian authorities. And I don't think we should be speculating on what that is. And I think they deserve our full support to reaching their goals. Sorry. What I sometimes see, and what I really don't like, is politicians and scholars trying to be helpful by sketching what would be a fair peace without even asking the Ukrainians. I mean, they have been invaded. They are in their right, and their wishes should be the basis of what we want to reach. And I today cannot tell you, even if I speak to them quite a lot, I cannot tell you what their bottom line is. I don't ask them to tell me their bottom line, but it's their bottom line that should be our guiding principle.
I was kind of recently in Armenia, a wonderful country with a long history and strong cultural roots. And I was trying to teach them European values, European integration. And I asked them what they expect from Europe. And they said nothing, nothing. I said, why? They said, what we want is security. Security against our neighbors. And security we can only expect either from Russia or from the US. The EU has no army. They cannot defend us. Are they right?
Well, it's not the first time I've heard that argument. But I think if you look, let's take the historic example of the country I admire a lot, which is Poland, or the Baltic states. But Poland is an interesting case in point, because Polish borders, you know, if Germany was strong, Poland as a country was 300 kilometers to the east. If Germany was weak and Russia was strong, Poland as a country was 300 kilometers to the west. If both the neighbors were strong, there was no Poland. And now nobody disputes Poland's borders. It is because of what the Polish people do themselves. It is because of the security guarantees of NATO. It is also because of the enormous economic transformation that happened because of the enlargement process of the EU and the integration of Poland in the EU. So there is no contradiction. For our security, we need our own people. You know, the Poles, I think, are at 4% defense spending of their GDP today. That's their own effort. Secondly, NATO is a bedrock for their security. And thirdly, also the EU has a part in that security. So there is no contradiction. The only thing is, if you're further away, like Armenia, I can understand that you have a different vision of Europe and the European Union. And then I think the European Union should also think in different terms than just either you're a full member or you're not in. I think that this is going to be one of the challenges of the next decades. How do you define a closer relationship with the European Union without immediately having to be a full-fledged member? And I think for countries, especially like Armenia and Georgia, perhaps, this might be also, even though Georgia's on a different path, this might still be, even if it's just a stepping stone, it might still be a way to go without straining the process too much, or without asking of countries more than they can deliver.
We could suggest a bilateral way, but we might not do that right now. Is the Ukrainian war, at the end of the day, promoting a common security and foreign policy in the European Union?
I think it's a combination of the Ukrainian. It's a combination of rediscovering the reality of a potential new Iron Curtain in Europe. Because let me make this point again. It is a completely different vision of a nation, whether your vision is, I was an empire, I want to restore the empire, and my security is based on conquering other countries to keep others far away from my borders. That is Putin's vision. Our vision of security is sharing our destiny. Even this is what Churchill talked about. who would have advocated here in Zurich, 1 year after the end of the war, there needs to be reconciliation between France and Germany, with the countries completely destroyed, with populations completely traumatized, but he had that vision. And I think it is essential that this vision remain the basis upon which we explain to the outside world what European integration really is. It is enlarged patriotism by sharing a destiny. And that is something that has been strengthened by Putin's aggression and is also strengthened by the fact that the United States, whether it's Trump or another president, is rightfully asking of Europeans to be a bigger part in their own security than they were in the past. And that we can only do if we stick together. And if we don't stick together, we will not be able to find the capital we need for the energy transition, for the development of R&D, for the development of our industry, and then we will never have even the 2% of taxpayers' money for defense. So all these subjects are interlinked, and we need economies and politics of scale on a continental level if we want to have a chance to compete with the US and China in the future.
When you speak about enlarged patriotism, do you basically mean that we should stick to our common values, such as democracy, rule of law, personal freedoms, human rights?
Yes, because if patriotism is doing the best for your country, that's what I see as patriotism. And that is based on the country you're from, in my case, the Netherlands. And I honestly believe that descending into nationalism and seeing your neighbor as an adversary or a competitor is not acting in the best interest of your country. So that's not patriotic. I think it is patriotic to say we're going to share sovereignty there where national sovereignty no longer gets us out of trouble or shapes the future. That is, in my view, real patriotism. That's what I think Churchill meant with enlarged patriotism. The reconciliation between France and Germany was enlarging the patriotism of the French and the Germans. And I think this is still the basic concept of what we're working with today.
Do you think what you believe in is what the majority of Europeans believe in? Do you think that the EU, the European integration process, is seen by most Europeans as such a progressive, positive element that they should support it? Or is it more, in a way, fading away a bit? You know, the EU is reluctant to revise its treaties because they're afraid in some countries there might be a rejection and then you cannot further go on in the integration process. So is this what you rightly say? Is this, you think, majority-wise?
I tried to make the argument that a politician should not just say what the majority thinks, but should say what they think should be the way forward and then hope to get a majority behind those ideas. I think that sort of politics is lacking a bit today. And I do believe that, the fundamental change we've seen in the last decades is that the belief in progress, the belief in increased social economic position has sort of turned into the opposite. So the conveyor belt going up was the general perception for decades after the Second World War, I think until 15 to 20 years ago. Now the general perception in the middle classes is the conveyor belt is going down. And all I want to do is stay on top of the conveyor belt. And this has led in many of our societies to reverse solidarity. So I don't want to share my destiny with Greeks who retire at 45 and spend most of the time at the beach. I mean, these idiotic perceptions, these lies about fellow Europeans have become part of the public debate everywhere in Europe. And on the other hand, my Italian friends, I spent a lot of time in Italy, I lived there for quite some time, Italian friends saying, you Dutch just want to starve us with your frugal policies, because then it means you can sell more stuff to us and our economy will die. I mean, these perceptions back and forth is what's weakening us. And this is being fostered by X and by all these new media and by horrible images of each other that are shared. And we need to speak out against this. And this is a responsibility of politicians. It's a responsibility of, I would say, also of anyone who's active in the public sphere. Also, academia has a huge responsibility to play in all of this. And I'm not saying this to push it away from me. I'm fully aware of my responsibility at this. But we are at a time when, if you believe in progress and you think, I'm doing well, not well enough, might do well in 10 years' time, better 10 years' time, but my kids will be really better off. That's a different proposition than today. I'm still okay, but my kids will be in a shitty situation. I don't want, but that's going to happen. So what you feel, if you're going up, you extend your hand and you take with you people who are not as far as you are, and you hope that they will go up as well. If the conveyor belt goes the other way, what you do is you kick the people away who are below you because you're afraid they're going to drag you down. And that sort of reverse solidarity has become part of European society too much. And I think we need to find a way of demonstrating that progress is still possible, that improvement of life is still possible, that a better future, perhaps redefined, a better future not in how many cars I have or how many TV sets I have, but in what is our welfare, how's our environment doing, how's our economy thriving, do we have clean jobs, do we have clean lives? These things are also part of our well-being that should be promoted as something to aspire to. We need a project to aspire to, and we don't have that right now. We're just afraid of the future instead of embracing the future.
Is one of today's weaknesses in politics opportunism, not only nationalism, but that politicians say what they think that the voters would like to hear from them instead of convincing them from their own projects and their own vision of the future?
I'm afraid what is bothering us as politicians is short-termism. If you compare us to leaders in big businesses, in my experience working in the EU, leaders of big businesses understand that their project must be about the next 20, 30, 40 years if they want their businesses to survive. So well, let me give you two counterexamples before I finish this argument. If they are not throttled by shareholders who want short-term results, if they're not throttled by shareholders who want short-term results, they can be bold and plan for the next 30 years. And I compare us to leaders who are throttled by shareholders who want instant results. And if you don't deliver the results, they'll vote you out. And that in every Western democracy, since the pandemic, every incumbent has been voted out. So what are citizens who are insecure, who are worried about the future, who did not see us deliver for a long time, they rightly want to see results, and they want to see it now. And that's what turns politics into short-termism. And that is something, if the center is weaker and weaker, short-termism becomes ever shorter. And that is a phenomenon I see in most Western countries today. And that's perhaps my biggest worry, frankly.
Let me ask you one last question, a different one that we have done before we open for the general discussion. You were Vice President of the European Commission.
Can't deny that.
Yeah. You experienced Switzerland trying to find a way of common understanding or common interests without integrating into European Union.
Formally integrated.
Formally integrated. How do you see this Swiss position? Do you have any understanding for what we are fighting for, what we are looking for? Do you think these are all nasty bastards, those Swiss? They resist, a necessary development in Europe, or how do you see that? How is the Commission seeing that?
And of course, you want an honest answer. No,
always.
I'm just joking. I'm just joking. For the European Commission, my colleagues at the European Commission are very much into the nitty-gritty of treaties, etc., etc. And it was such a privilege to work with what I think is arguably the best civil service in the world for 9 years. It was such an honor to be able to work with such talented people for so long. But they're not politicians. So when they look at the negotiations with Switzerland, they look at the facts and they see, and then they see the rhetoric coming out of political circles, and they think, what the hell are they talking about? This is not what we're proposing. Why are we being put into a corner like this? And so if you believe that you're not being, the negotiators on the Swiss side, by the way, are very professional and doing a very professional job. But you all read the newspapers, you all read the comments, and you think, what is happening here? Is there an honest willingness to have a new agreement, or are they playing with us? If they're playing with us, we're not going to negotiate. We're going to stick to our guns, and we're not going to give in on anything, because everything we give away will be seen by other partners across the world and immediately put into their pockets and say, we want that as well, even if then at the end of the day Switzerland would say no. So I think there is a huge willingness at the top of the Swiss politics in the Council and at the top of the European Commission to reach an agreement, and reach an agreement soon. This is, I can say, Ursula von der Leyen wants nothing more than to reach an agreement. But you have to give the negotiators the assurance that there is a willingness to actually solve the last remaining problems, which I grant you are very complicated problems, but in my view can be solved by the end of this year, I would even say, if I'm being ambitious, and if not, early next year. And I think we should both have the ambition to do that. Let me add to this one thing. Everybody respects Switzerland's neutrality. It's the bedrock of what Switzerland is, and everybody respects that. But on terms, I've worked with Switzerland for so long, in the UN, in the OSCE, in the Council of Europe. Switzerland is not neutral on fundamental values. Switzerland is a strong proponent of fundamental values. And what is at stake today in Europe are fundamental values, and you cannot be neutral about fundamental values, and Switzerland has never been neutral about fundamental values. And let's work on that as well. And I think this would be a good basis to look at the security situation in Europe. We don't want empires to come back in Europe. Switzerland doesn't want empires to come back in Europe. So I honestly count on Switzerland to support us to make sure that Putin doesn't get his way.
We have fought the Austrians for too long, right? So now, please, who has a question, a comment here from Ukraine, and afterwards from Germany, please.
Yes, Mr. Timmermans, thank you so much. I appreciate your speech. And as you mentioned, my region, Kharkiv, I'm from Kharkiv, and deeply appreciation for your speech about Ukrainians. And my question is very short. You told us about what Europe should do in this historical moment, but I would like to ask your vision, what Ukraine should do to clearly understand what Europe wants from us and what we shouldn't do in relationship between Europe and Ukraine. Thank you.
Well, first of all, win the war. That would be, and you know, with all the suffering going on in Ukraine, I will not lecture Ukraine on anything, but I will still give you an honest answer. You know, to help this process along, look for partners in Europe. Many are willing to help you fight corruption. That is the one thing I would ask of Ukraine. Fight corruption. Put industry in the place of industry, not above democracy, not above the rule of law, not above the state. And I think President Zelensky deserves far more support from Western structure, from European structures in this fight against corruption. Because you know, sir, just as much as I do, that Putin and his cronies are also behind the corruption in Ukraine. So that would be my answer. It's part of the war effort to fight the corruption. And it will make negotiations with the EU a lot easier if Ukraine has a proven record of beating corruption.
Mr. Timmermans, you just bombarded a very easy question. I have another one for you. You made a very convincing argument that we all need to help. But the counter-argument is always there are red lines. What about these red lines? They seem to me to be not very convincing, but they are brought up time and again. What's your argument on that?
I'll give you a cheeky answer. Putin's red lines on Ukraine are just as valuable as Obama's red lines on Syria.
Not much.
Nothing whatsoever. It's a lot of rhetoric. It's a lot of threats. You know, we need to sustain this effort. And I say to you as a German, we need to give them the arms they need to attack the places from where they're shooting missiles into kindergartens, into hospitals, into people's apartments. and they should get, also from Germany, I would say, the weapons to do that.
Other questions or comments from your side, please? There is a hand here, gentleman, and then there's another one with the red pullover.
Mr. Timmermans, well, it was again very nice to listen to you. I happened to serve as ambassador in the Netherlands at the time of you being the foreign minister. Well, it was a pleasure today again, but there was one issue, transatlantic relations, and blame on current, well, on the forthcoming administration. And blaming them for going alone. So just to be fair, I would like to draw your attention to Lithuanian experience during the first Trump presidency. We are not cherishing the Trump presidency, but our bilateral relations with the United States during the first presidency of Trump were going uphill, and very strongly uphill. That was the time when, next to your the Dutch heavy presence in henceforward presence of NATO in Lithuania, we've got also a bilateral American battalion, heavy battalion in Lithuania. Our trade was going up, and that was because we were delivering on defense. So in your blame on America for going alone, I missed the recognition that partially Europe is to be blamed for really free riding for 3 decades and still spending not enough on defense.
Well, Ambassador, I think I might not have been clear enough, but I agree with your argument, and I thought I had expressed that in my intervention. But let me be very clear once again. You know, this rethinking of the commitment to the European defense is not just something Trump has done or is doing, is something that any American president, even if Harris had won the election, she would have also asked of Europeans to do more. So that's not the point. I think there has to be a need for Europeans to step up and do the 2% and go over the 2%. There is no choice but to do that. But at the same time, I'm just trying to analyze what President-elect Trump has said about this. If he says, I will stop this war in 1 day, if one of his advisors has said last week, well, Ukraine should give up Crimea, Ukraine should give up all the territory that's occupied by Russia right now, I am a bit wary, I'm a bit worried about what the administration might do as far as, you know, for Trump. Trump has this huge admiration for Putin, as we know. He hasn't been hiding this. And at the same time, he wants this success of ending a war. But ending a war in unjust terms is not ending a war. That's rewarding an invader. And this is something we cannot do. And to be very clear, I think there is a case to be built why it is in Trump's interest that he sticks to the same policy as his predecessor did. I still believe it can be done. But for that to happen, Europeans need to speak with one voice. And now many leaders are trying to outdo one another in flattery. I can flatter him better than you, is what I see happening. Whereas I think he's going to try and pick off one European after the other, like he did in his first presidency. And he will be nice to Lithuania, but he will keep hitting Merkel at the time in Germany, keep criticizing this, keep criticizing that, and that leads to European divisions. We need to have one voice, and it could be the High Representative, it could be the Secretary General of NATO, it could be Donald Tusk, whom I really trust with this message. One voice speaking clearly on behalf of all Europeans, pleading with the American president that it is in his interest that Putin stops with his imperial policies.
We have probably one last question there, or the second one. We take both together, right, if you agree, and then we go forward.
Thank you, Mr. Timmermans, for your speech. You mentioned climate change, defense, and economic competitiveness as 3 topics of highest importance. So far, in my feeling as a citizen, I do not see most politicians in Europe to have recognized the seriousness of the situation. And as a citizen, I'm well aware that solving these issues takes time and is complicated. So I can't expect immediate results, but I expect politicians to recognize the problems and start solving and getting the path on their way. So what is your analysis as a politician on this situation? How do we get on track in solving these issues?
Okay, let's take the second question by the next gentleman. Yeah, please.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Timmermans, do you think that the European populace understands that if you answer your title question positively, and I think you have, does the European populace understand that European leadership has nothing much more to offer than Mr. Churchill had to offer in 1940, in the sense that blood, tears, toil and sweat?
Not quite a gloomy question, frankly, at the end. But I'll try and answer both questions. I think the lock-in we have now, the emotions run high in my country, don't know about Switzerland, but in many countries, on issues pertaining to identity, migration, where are we vis-a-vis the other, who's the other in society, can I trust the other in society? And that is creating too much paralysis right now. And so we are not talking enough about the issues that are overarching. How is it possible that the climate crisis, which is the only real crisis that now threatens our very survival, if it is not tackled, the only crisis, if we do not reduce CO2 emissions, that will lead to massive streams of refugees coming to Europe and other places. The only crisis that could really disrupt our economic and industrial structures in a very quick way. Why is it that it is now portrayed as, well, fake news or the woke agenda or whatever? What has happened to us that we don't see or don't want to see the threat? This is a question that really is on my mind a lot. Now, I think Biden has found a brilliant answer to that question by calling his Green Deal the Inflation Reduction Act. So nobody saw that it was a Green Deal. So it wasn't put in the woke corner straight away. And I think we as Europeans should be thinking about, you can really defend and promote climate change policies through industrial policies, through investment policies, like the Americans have done. It is very easy to build a case to show that renewable energy, even at a small scale, a scale of housing, at a scale of cities, leads to lower consumer prices for energy and to a lower housing costs, which is a huge issue in Switzerland today. So you have to be able to, we are, until now, all the policies we've done to fight climate change have benefited people who are already well off. And that has created a huge backlash, and people saying, oh yeah, it's for the rich. It's for the Tesla driving tofu eaters who are well off already. And I, as a normal worker, it's too expensive for me. If we can reformulate that to say to people who have rented housing, social housing, we guarantee you, if we help you with the reconversion of your house, your total cost in a month will be lower than now. If you can, I think it's not that difficult. These are the things we need to do to convince people to be part of a transition that is inevitable. The one thing I find so difficult today is to convince people that the longer you wait, the more difficult it will be, the more damage will be done, and the higher the cost will be. That is one of the most difficult things, and I really need a lot of help to convince people with that. Now, moving to the question about...
The gloomy one.
Yeah, are we heading for Armageddon? I don't think so. I don't think so. I mean, you know... yeah, Putin is sitting on nuclear weapons. He's can you just try and imagine, he has already sacrificed 700,000 young Russians in this war. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine that? Just a sheer number? How many people live in Zurich? Can you imagine that? Just let the number of people impress you. His economy is going down the drain. Our economies are struggling, but we're still very strong. We need not to undervalue our strength. The weakness comes from within, not from without. And the weakness is in our inability to create enough momentum in the coalition that is necessary. And there, for the first time, I think, since the end of the European divide, I say this for the fourth time, I mean it seriously, we need leadership from Central and Eastern Europe, people with the experience, people with the efforts over the last 40 years to invest in the future, to suffer for the future. They should lead us now. We have become in Western Europe way too complacent. And I think that is the way forward. But there's no need to despair. We are so much stronger. The Russian economy is smaller than Spain's economy. I mean, let's just keep things in perspective, and then we can overcome this very difficult period. But if we give in to him, he will never stop.
Thank you very much, Mr. Timmermans. Now we come to the closing remarks given by Oliver Bartol, a member of the Geschäftsleitung of the Bank Bern.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear Mr. Timmermans, thank you very much for this fascinating and insightful speech that you actually delivered at a very important moment of time. Thank you for also making the case for resilience by Europe in the face of renewed aggression, but also in the face of echoes of history that we have actually hoped were behind us. You have highlighted that resilience means more than endurance. It's the willingness to defend values, not just for our own nations, but also for the stability and prosperity of our entire continent. Holding this speech here in Zurich, as Churchill famously did in 1946, illustrates an important point. Europe must stand united, not just as European Union, but actually as a continent. Switzerland and the European Union are in many ways united. We share same values, long history, languages, cultural backgrounds, and our economies are very much integrated. And the last 25 years of bilateral agreements have actually proven to be mutually beneficial, even though Switzerland is not yet a member of the European Union. As a chief risk officer of Julius Baer, standing in actually on behalf of our chairman who had a scheduling conflict, he had to attend a family matter on short notice. And Julius Baer being one of the leading global banks, I find actually strong and good relations between Switzerland and Europe particularly important as they benefit our clients, our economies, and our societies. Mr. Timmermans, over the years we have actually developed a tradition to offer the guest speakers at the Churchill Symposium with a symbolic gift. You are Dutch, and the Netherlands and Switzerland are similar countries in many ways. Both are relatively small, with open economies, focusing on international trade and competitiveness. The history in both countries is actually built on a mix of Germanic and Latin influences. The Dutch gain wide perspectives through their centuries-long connection to the sea, while the Swiss get there from the top of the mountains. And geographically, both countries are connected via the Rhine, this famous river that originates in the Swiss mountains and ends in the North Sea in the Netherlands. We all know you from the time as a European Commissioner. You are not only a European at heart, but you were born and today live again in the heart of Europe, the famous city of Maastricht. And this led me to the following idea for a suitable gift. Switzerland, on the contrary, may not be the heart of Europe, but we have the top of Europe. At the Jungfrau Joch, amidst our beautiful mountains, at 3,454 meters above sea level, you can find the highest railway station of Europe. I would love for you to travel from the heart of Europe to the very top of Europe. Hence, I would like to offer you a ticket for a scenic train ride to the top of Europe, an amazing UNESCO World Heritage Site. As you came by train to Zurich, I'm sure you will enjoy this beautiful excursion on your next visit to Switzerland. And dear guests, we have now come to the end of yet another wonderful Churchill event. I would like to thank you all for joining us tonight and together with Professor Andreas Kellerhals. I look forward to welcome you back here in the Aula again for one of our next Churchill events soon. Have a very nice evening. Thank you.